Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. A few months ago, a year ago, we were hearing a lot of news stories about popular discontent and popular uprisings in Venezuela. That didn't really pan out, and we covered that extensively on this program. Now we're hearing about popular uprisings, protests, and demonstrations in Cuba. And here to discuss that with us now is Ben Norton. Ben is assistant editor of The Gray Zone and a journalist. He is speaking to us from Nicaragua, where he lives. So first of all, Ben, welcome back to the program.
It's always a pleasure to be here, RJ. Thanks for the interview.
Oh, it's always great to have you. And let's start with this. Let's just go as basic as possible. What's going on in Cuba?
Well, anyone who knows the most basic, history of Cuba knows that this small island nation of around 11 million people has been suffocating under a horrible and illegal U.S. blockade for 60 years now. On January 1st, 1959, revolutionaries who actually at first were not communists, they were left-wing nationalists and anti-imperialists led by Fidel Castro. They overthrew a U.S. puppet dictatorship led by the right-wing dictator Fulgencio Batista. And in 1959, they declared a revolution. And it was a national liberation struggle against what was really a kind of U.S. colonial regime. Cuba, in 1898, became a U.S. colony after the Spanish-American War. And Cubans were struggling for independence for decades. And they succeeded in 1959. And almost immediately, the U.S. government imposed this blockade, a crippling, suffocating blockade. And we can talk more about that because it's not really understood. A lot of people in the U.S. and Western Europe, they think that this is just that Cuba can't do trade with the United States. It's much worse than that. The U.S. prevents Cuba from doing trade with many countries around the world because those other countries fear what are called secondary sanctions. So this is also true for Venezuela and Iran. The U.S. is basically telling the entire world and has been telling the world for over 60 years that Cuba cannot do business with the rest of the world unless those countries want to face sanctions by the U.S., what are called secondary sanctions, and have their trade with the U.S. cut off. And of course, the U.S. is the largest economic power in the world, competing with China. And the U.S. has a chokehold on the international financial system, which we've seen through the SWIFT mechanism, which is used by international banks to process transactions. So if the U.S. doesn't want your banks to accept money from a foreign transaction, they can just cut off your banks. We've seen that with Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, because the U.S. controls the SWIFT system. So Cuba's been under this medieval blockade for over 60 years since the triumph of the revolution. And today, there are economic difficulties, it's true, and they're almost entirely caused by the blockade. And it's especially ironic because this is happening right now when in Haiti, we've seen this horrific assassination of the president, Jovenel Moise, and it's a very shady case. The U.S. government has many links to it. It was carried out by these Colombian paramilitaries, some of whom were trained by the U.S. military, and some of whom, by the way, were actually informants for the FBI and DEA. But anyway, the point is that Haiti is a country that is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, suffering from basically a failed state after many U.S. government-backed coups and these horrible corrupt regimes, and now this assassination. And until recently, we never heard about the massive protests going on in Haiti, which greatly outnumber the relatively small protests we've seen this July in Cuba. And of course, there's a reason for that, because in Haiti, the protests were against a U.S.-backed corrupt neoliberal regime that actually had suspended parliament and was running by diktat, totally a dictatorship. And in Cuba, of course, the U.S. government has a vested interest in greatly amplifying these protests and in misdirecting the anger. So yes, there are people protesting. The protests are very small. And in fact, we can talk more about the other protests, the other rallies. These are pro-government rallies we've seen, which actually have greatly outnumbered the anti-government protests. But the small protests that have existed are over economic difficulties caused by the blockade and by COVID. And because of COVID, Cuba lost its main source of foreign capital, its main source of hard cash reserves that it used to buy medicine, that it used to buy medical equipment, to buy food internationally, to the extent it even can because of the blockade. the tourist dollars that came in would go toward spending on those goods they could import. And now, because of COVID, tourism has totally dried up. So a major source of revenue for the Cuban government and the local economy has dried up because of COVID. So it's true there are difficulties, but the irony is that these very small protests are tiny compared to the massive uprisings we've seen in Haiti, in Colombia, in Chile, which got paltry to no media coverage, whereas the international media is just insanely disproportionately over covering these protests. And as we'll talk about today, actually spreading fake news. We can talk about examples of the media taking photos of what were pro-government rallies in Cuba and portraying them as anti-government rallies. But anyone who's spent time in Latin America, who knows the basics of Latin American history and politics, they could tell from these photos, it's very obvious that they were actually pro-government photos being falsely portrayed. So there's a huge fake news campaign going on, and it's so similar to other destabilization operations backed by the U.S. targeting left-wing governments in Latin America, from Nicaragua here in 2018 with a U.S.-backed coup attempt, and then the next year in Bolivia in 2019 when there was an actual coup that overthrew the government. There's a lot of parallels to those campaigns of destabilization.
And Ben Norton, before we go further, I just want to underscore a couple of things you've said from my point of view, which is people today, I don't think, realize the extent to which, for example, in the 1950s, the sort of degraded cultural supremacy attitude the United States had toward Cuba. Cuba was, to Americans, Cuba was a playground. It was a place where, you could hear good music, and there were dancers, and it was like an almost a combination like gambling house and brothel for American elites was the view of it. Very degrading, very condescending, very colonial culturally as well as economically. So I think to this day, the existence of the Cuban Revolution, the Cuban government, is a rebuke to America's sense of hegemony, especially in this hemisphere. And that also drives, I think, a lot of its treatment of a lot of the countries you mentioned, as well as economic interests. And I think that the continuing presence of the Cuban Revolution is an embarrassment, propaganda-wise and in other ways, and that what we're seeing now cannot be, the kind of selective news coverage and exaggeration, fake news, can't be seen in isolation, but as part of a kind of, by this point, 60-year war on Latin America, conducted by the U.S., going back to me, the news stories we were hearing about Chile under Allende, and how those news stories led to a coup there, and so on. Am I drawing inferences that aren't there, or do you largely agree with what I said?
I agree 100%, RJ. I think you made a lot of important points. One, I wanted to stress this point again. It's important. Cuba has a socialist government. Absolutely. It's proudly socialist. But at the beginning of the revolution, which was called actually the July 26th movement, because it was launched on July 26th, and it was an armed struggle, a guerrilla campaign against a U.S.-backed puppet dictatorship, Fulgencio Batista. They did not identify as communists, yet alone Marxist-Leninists. This is actually historical irony. It was the U.S. attacks, the blockade, and the coup attempts, and the invasion, the terrorist invasion known as the Bay of Pigs, which was a U.S. military invasion of a sovereign country to try to overthrow its government. Those were the factors that led the Cuban Revolution to further radicalizing and moving further left. I want to stress this point again. It's so important to understand. Cuba was turned into a U.S. colony in 1898, along with Puerto Rico and the Philippines. The so-called Spanish-American War, the U.S. told these countries, we're going to help fight for your freedom from Spanish colonialism. And then, of course, the U.S. made them colonies. And Puerto Rico today is still a colony. And that's why, if you look at the Cuban and Puerto Rican flags, they're basically the same flag. You just invert the blue and red. And why are the flags red, white, and blue? Because they're based on the U.S. flag. The U.S. government created those flags. And now the Cuban flag is a symbol of freedom internationally and anti-imperialism. But it was created by the U.S. colonial regime. And in 1959, it was a struggle against U.S. colonialism. It was not even a communist struggle. It was when the U.S. began imposing sanctions and a blockade eventually that Cuba allied with the Soviet Union, and then Fidel Castro declared the revolution to be Marxist-Leninist. Che Guevara, who he was a Marxist-Leninist, but Fidel at first was not a Marxist-Leninist, they radicalized the revolution even further and moved to the left. And that was true for a lot of struggles, not just in Latin America, but in the global South. That's true even for Vietnam. Let's not remember that
the
Vietnamese struggle was fundamentally a national liberation struggle that was radicalized by the French colonial occupation and then the U.S. war and became communist. Ho Chi Minh himself originally was not a communist. He was a progressive nationalist. So,
and he reached out to the U.S. and he quoted Abraham Lincoln, and he did all these things that did not fit with the image we were given of him in the 1960s. Yeah,
absolutely. And I want people to understand really quickly. I'm going to share my screen here. It's so important to understand what the U.S. government was saying at this time after the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. So here I have up. This is a U.S. State Department cable from the Office of the Historian. It's from April 1960. So the revolution triumphed on January 1st, 1959. So this is just a year after the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. And this is an internal document acknowledging that this is, again, from the U.S. State Department. Quote, the majority of Cubans support Castro, and quote, there is no effective political opposition. And they talk about how the government was becoming communist, largely in response to the U.S. aggression because they became allies of the Soviet Union. And then the U.S. State Department cable says explicitly, quote, the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. And then they add that every possible means should be undertaken promptly to weaken the economic life of Cuba. And they add to make the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. That is the explicitly stated goal of the U.S. blockade to this day. That is the explicitly stated goal. And in fact, I have another tweet in this thread here. My colleague Max Blumenthal, who you've interviewed, he wrote an article about a top Biden envoy on Iran, and named Richard Nephew, who wrote this book called The Art of Sanctions. And in the book, he openly, this is a recent book. This is not a 1960 State Department internal cable. In his book, he admits that the goal of the U.S. sanctions on Iran is to deprive civilians of food, increase unemployment and inequality, and destroy the Iranian economy so the Iranian people will rise up and overthrow their government. That is the explicitly stated goal of the U.S. sanctions and economic warfare and blockade on Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, and other countries. So we should stop acting. There are so many people right now saying that Cuba uses the blockade as an excuse and that all of the problems are caused supposedly by incompetence and corruption, which is hilarious because, again, as someone who I live in Latin America, I've spent many years here, Cuba, it's not to say the Cuban government is perfect, but you have to compare apples to apples and not to oranges. Cuba, compare it to its neighbors, compare it to the Dominican Republic, compare it to Haiti, compare it to Honduras, these countries that are extremely violent, controlled by gangs, extreme poverty, extreme inequality, no healthcare, no education. So Cuba, what it's been able to accomplish for under 60 years as a poor island nation under a medieval blockade for 60 years, what it's been able to accomplish is pretty incredible. There's actually one other thing I want to share here, which is these are statistics from the World Bank, and they show that Cuba, again, a poor island nation that has been under a blockade for 60 years, actually has higher life expectancy and lower infant mortality rates than the United States. So if you look at this map, this is from the World Bank, certainly not some communist bastion. I mean, this is a U.S. government-led institution, the World Bank. The data shows in 1960, the beginning of the data, right at the beginning of the revolution, that the life expectancy of birth at birth in Cuba was just under, it was 63 years old. And today, the life expectancy is 79, which is slightly above the United States, the richest country in the world. And now look, here's another graph. This is even more incredible. the infant mortality rate per 1,000 live births in 1959, 1960, at the beginning of the triumph of the revolution, it was over 47 children out of every 1,000, which is nearly double what the US was at the time. And now look at the graph. Cuba has a lower infant mortality rate than the United States does. And this is, again, we're comparing apples to oranges. We're comparing a poor country in Latin America to the richest country on earth. So the fact that Cuba has been able to accomplish all of this is really impressive. And that's not to say that the government is perfect, of course, but again, we have to compare it to its neighbors. And no one talks about the situation in Dominican Republic or in Haiti. They always compare Cuba to rich imperialist countries like the United States and Canada and Western Europe that developed their countries off of colonialism.
And a couple points, Ben Norton. One is that another reason, obviously, in all the coverage we've seen in the last week or so about Cuba, there's been nothing about these mortality rates or life expectancy statistics. Those two are incentive for the United States government to try to crush Cuba because they are a living rebuke to our way of life and to our economic system. So that, to me, I've always felt that's a contributing factor in all of this. And I do want to make the point before we go on, because I feel it so strongly, that the sanctions that we're applying against Iran, which have caused devastating harm to children, which we will remember Madeleine Albright thought was just fine, and when asked about it, mass deaths of children and so on, that have caused enormous suffering with the advent of COVID-19, really horrific effects on the countries suffering from sanction. I just want to make the point that what we are attempting to do in order to get the citizens of these countries to change their government is illegal to do to animals. It is illegal to to inflict pain, suffering, and death on an animal in order to train it to behave the way you'd like it to behave. You will be arrested for that. And yet we do this to millions of people around the world and think nothing of it. We should be appalled.
Yeah, I mean, you can say that the U.S. government, in terms of its foreign policy, it treats people in the global south worse than people domestically treat animals. And
absolutely,
it's not even just a matter of treatment. I mean, it's a matter of sadism. I just want to stress again, these are the stated policies of the U.S. government in its internal cables, and even in this book written by a top U.S. government State Department envoy on sanctions. Another important point, you keep talking about the threat of a good example. It's so important to stress that. This is a term the U.S. government has used in the past, the threat of a good example, because the U.S. can, and not just the U.S., Western European countries, these capitalist countries, now neoliberal countries in which billionaires control the majority of the wealth in the country and inequality is increasing, and there's no healthcare and there's no education and unemployment is increasing and there's fewer and fewer opportunities looking forward in the future. They don't want the threat of a good possibility because it would be a symbol to their own people to say that there is an alternative, that you could actually have a government that provides healthcare and education and employment and all of these policies. So that's why one of the reasons that the U.S. has and Western European countries have spent so many years and so many resources and blood and treasure trying to violently overthrow these governments. And now they're called the troika of tyranny, right? Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. They happen to be the three socialist governments, strongest socialist governments in Latin America. But I think there's another important point, and that's that these governments, these countries, are part of a larger international project. It's not just the threat of a good example in terms of domestic policies of education and healthcare, but it's also that these countries are committed to building a multipolar world and breaking the institutional control that Washington and Brussels have over them, not just economically, of course, through the IMF and the World Bank. And anyone who knows the history, the modern history of Latin America knows that there's this trap, this odious debt. What happens is these right-wing governments come in that are puppets of the U.S., and they take these massive billion-dollar loans from the IMF, which traps the country in unpayable debt. It's sometimes debt that has interest that's like a huge percentage of GDP, and it's impossible to pay off. And then that forces the U.S. government, that forces the local government to capitulate to the U.S., to privatize state assets, to cut social programs, to impose austerity measures. So these countries in Latin America, the progressive governments, have been trying to break free from that. Venezuela cut ties with the IMF, and Nicaragua and Cuba, of course. And they're also internationally focused on building a new political apparatus as well. And in fact, just last week, just in June, we saw, or early July, we saw the creation of this new group at the United Nations, which is called the Friends of the UN Charter, which is these 18 anti-imperialist countries, not only including Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua and Bolivia, but it also includes Algeria, includes Iran, and includes China, Russia, Zimbabwe. So it's a bunch of countries in the global south that are trying to build basically something similar to the kind of Bandung Conference, or to when Malcolm X was killed, he was part of this movement of Afro-Asian solidarity, trying to build this international movement looking beyond borders. And to Washington, that is just as scary as the threat of a good example. And Cuba has internationally been such a powerful voice for multilateralism, building a multipolar world, and opposing this kind of top-down domination by Washington and Brussels. So I'm showing my screen here. Another thing, we've seen that expressed at the United Nations. Cuba is so respected in international politics in terms of its diplomacy. This small country punches so much above its weight that for 29 years in a row, the entire international community, including Western European powers, which often are allied with the U.S. on foreign policy, the entire world has voted against the U.S. blockade. This most recent vote that happened just a few weeks ago, it was 184 countries, almost every single UN member state voted against the U.S. blockade. They voted to end the U.S. blockade, which is illegal under international law. And only 2 countries voted in support of the blockade. Of course, the U.S. and the 51st state, Israel. And there were 3 abstentions. This graphic was actually, there's an error in the UN graphic, but the 3 abstentions were the far-right Colombian narco regime, the far-right Bolsonaro regime in Brazil, and Ukraine. So we're talking about a country that is actually deeply respected on the international stage because it is so committed to diplomacy and multilateralism. And if you listen to UN conferences, as I sometimes do as a journalist, and you listen to these boring international meetings, Cuba is often a voice for international law and diplomacy, whereas it's the U.S. that is vetoing resolutions that it doesn't like, that is just totally scorning international law and doing whatever it wants.
You know, and this is a bit of far field from the topic, Ben Norton, so I don't want to go too deep into it unless you want to, but it's also, in my mind, one of the reasons why the United States is so heavily promoting a new Cold War with China. Because as these countries look for, you mentioned the SWIFT system, which has an iron grip on the global banking system. There are many variations of that, I think, in global power dynamics, economic power dynamics, and with China willing to extend loans on different terms than less usurious than the IMF or others might be, less ideologically controlling, and so on. I think there's a great and legitimate fear that, legitimate in the sense that it could happen, that people may have alternatives in these countries that they didn't have before, for trade agreements, for banking systems, as well as loans and that type of thing that could undermine this hegemonic U.S. control of the global economy.
That's absolutely right. I would highly recommend anyone watching this to check out the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. He talks about exactly how the system works. And the U.S. orchestrates coups, and then they take huge IMF loans, and then they're trapped in debt. And any country that tries to challenge that is seen as a threat. And that's not even to say that all of these governments, like Iran or Zimbabwe, it doesn't mean that they have perfect internal politics. Of course, there are criticisms and contradictions, but these countries are part of a larger international movement that is basically just trying to break free of U.S. hegemony, and also the European Union as a kind of extension of that. Because we've seen since the end of World War II that the U.S. and to a lesser extent Western Europe have dominated the world, and they did it through instruments not only like the IMF and the World Bank, but also through NATO. And we keep seeing NATO expand. Now Ukraine is saying that they're going to join NATO. Colombia, which is not even part of the North Atlantic, it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Colombia is an honorary observer of NATO. I mean, NATO is the political instrument that keeps together the U.S. empire it's in some ways it has similarities with the kind of Commonwealth system of the British Empire. And Cuba is not only a thread of a good example in terms of its economic policies domestically and social programs, but because it's been a leader in what's really a global decolonization struggle. You know, we talk about the decolonization movements of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s across Latin America, Asia, and Africa, as if they just decolonized and everything was good. But the reality is that if you go back and read the leftist socialist liberation leaders, especially Nkrumah in Africa, he and others were talking about neocolonialism, and that they had a kind of de facto political autonomy, but they had no economic autonomy. So we're still seeing this struggle, especially since not only the end of World War II, but especially since the end of the first Cold War, where George H.W. Bush declares a new world order. And that's not like, you know, it's not some conspiracy, the NWO Illuminati thing. What he meant was U.S. total hegemony, or as the neocons called it, full spectrum dominance. It was the end of history, Francis Fukuyama said. The U.S. government controls everything. And Cuba was a thorn in the side of the U.S. because the U.S. was saying that socialism failed, and that the U.S., Brussels, United States, Canada, Western Europe order, that's going to be the order for the rest of the world. They're going to dominate. And Cuba, and when the Sandinista government came back in Nicaragua, and Venezuela, and Bolivia, and to an increasing extent China, have all been exceptions to that, saying that no, there actually are more alternatives. So you mentioned Cuba's loans. I mean, it's not, or China's loans rather. That's not to say that China, of course, does it out of the kindness of its heart. It does have its own political motives, but China, it's true that China has much more favorable conditions on its loans. And if people don't trust me, they should go look up on YouTube Yanis Varoufakis, who was the former Greek minister who was part of the Syriza government. He talks about how they would have these meetings with China to have an economic agreement, and that they would try to have new conditions, and that China wouldn't even argue to say, okay, that China would just accept the conditions that the IMF and the European Central Bank would never even think about accepting. And in the case of Cuba, China and Cuba have very close relations, and they're part of this international movement that is building this new axis. And it's going to be so important as we move into the new Cold War, right? Cold War II. It's going to be really important to talk about this new axis that has been constructed, because Cuba, although it's a small island nation, and although it only has 11 million people compared to 1.3 or 1.4 billion for China, it actually still plays a very important role in international geopolitics. And if you're at the U.S. State Department, if you're a policymaker, it's not just about the economic policies of Cuba. It's really about its foreign policy as well, that really is a thorn in the side for the U.S.
Well, yes, including providing medical aid to other countries and offering it to New Orleans and after Katrina, and at other times in the U.S., and being capable of doing it, which again, as you say, you know, not to idealize them, but their accomplishments are considerable, given that it's roughly the population of Ohio. Yeah, but Ben Norton, I was a consultant for a while for the IMF, World Bank, and until I realized what I was doing. And I could tell you stories. Maybe someday I will. But that book is not entirely off base. I'll tell you that Confessions of a Hitman. But you also...
We should have you on to
anytime.
Talk about your...
Anytime. But before we let you go, if you can, I know you had some other things to say about the fake news that Americans are being fed, right? I mean, is there more you can elaborate about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I want to make 2 points about the fake news. One is just about blatant fake news that is being spread in social media and even in mainstream media. And then the other point is about the fake news in terms of COVID. There's this narrative being constructed that Cuba, that it somehow had a horrible COVID response, that it botched the COVID response, which is hilarious coming from the United States, which had over 600,000 deaths. But in terms of the fake news on social media, we've seen, for instance, a lot of these accounts, we've seen so many bots, and it's obvious that there are bots because there's all these accounts that were created like during the protests in the past few days or in the past few months, and they all have names that's like a name like Javier and then 8 numbers, or like Maria and then like a string of 8 numbers. These are bot accounts, and they all have these certain phrases that they keep repeating over and over again. And what they're doing is they're spamming celebrities, and they're trying to get celebrities, especially musicians, major actors, especially Latinos in the US, major like Latino actors and singers, to try to speak out against the Cuban government, to try to build this support leveraging popular social media platforms to spread this propaganda. And what they're doing is they're spreading so much fake news, a lot of these bots. And it's the same thing we saw during the coup attempt here in Nicaragua in 2018. In fact, it's the same hashtag, it's the same manual. It was SOS Nicaragua in 2018 when these protests began that spiraled into a very violent coup attempt. And then these gangs, these US government-backed forces that were armed, kind of like Contras, they were taking over neighborhoods and making these violent barricades. It's similar to what happened in Venezuela as well in 2014 and 2017 in the so-called guarimbas. There's a manual. I mean, these people are trained in how to do coups. And then in 2019, we saw the exact same thing in Bolivia with all the fake news claiming that Evo Morales supposedly committed fraud, a blatant lie, that the election was supposedly stolen. And then there were these bots that were created. And in fact, even the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which is an arm of the Organization of American States, totally a biased institution that helped oversee the coup, they later published a report admitting that there were over 68,000 bots created immediately before, during, and after the Bolivia coup to spread fake news and propaganda on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And here's an example of the bots we're seeing on Cuba saying, "Long live Cuba." There's supposedly this protest. It's from Egypt. It's a 2011 photo from Egypt. Anyone who knows what the Egyptian flag looks like can easily tell this is Egypt. There are so many other examples. Here's another example of fake news, not on social media, but in mainstream corporate media. This is The Guardian, the top British newspaper, as I call it, the Guardian of Blairism. They and other newspapers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they published this AP photo that claimed to be anti-government protesters. That's false. It's actually pro-government. As you can see here, the 26th of July flags, those are the flags symbolizing the revolution. It was actually a pro-government rally. And ironically, The Guardian they did publish a correction here saying that they were actually pro-government supporters. So we're seeing a lot of examples of actual fake news being spread. And that's not to say that there weren't protests, but the irony is that even the protests that existed, they're actually very tiny. And I have one more thing I'm going to share here, which is just, it really shows that the protests in Colombia, which have gone on for months, have been massive, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people participating, and that they got almost no coverage in mainstream US media. Meanwhile, in Cuba, there are these protests that are honestly very small. Look at this. This is hilarious. This is one of the right-wing Venezuelan accounts that's spreading a lot of anti-Cuba stuff on social media. And they're saying that they're living through the biggest citizens' protest in Cuba's history. The regime was not prepared for it and for this moment. And look at this protest. I mean, what is that, 50 people? And this is also a part, Malecon. This is the part, the Malecon on the water in Cuba. Anyone who's been to Havana, this is a very famous area tourists go to take photos. And a lot of average Cubans just hang out there. So some of these people might not even be protesters. So what's hilarious is that we're actually not talking about very big protests. And that's not to say that there aren't people with grievances. There are difficulties mostly caused by the blockade. But then there's one other issue that I want to conclude here before wrapping up. And that's the issue of COVID. One of the most cynical propaganda talking points we've seen related to this fake news. We've seen this idea that people are protesting, like the kind of more sophisticated propaganda, like Democrat talking point, is that Cubans are protesting because the government supposedly botched the coronavirus response, which is insane because Cuba has sent doctors to over 30 countries. They sent dozens of medical brigades to over 30 countries to help deal with COVID, including to rich countries like Italy. And Cuba has 5 COVID vaccines that it created. It created 5 separate COVID vaccines, this poor island nation under blockade. And in terms of the COVID response, despite the blockade, which is preventing it from buying medicines, it's preventing it from buying needles, but still, Cuba actually still has one of the best COVID responses in all of Latin America. And again, we have to compare apples to apples. Although in the case of the US, I mean, the COVID response was so bad that maybe you can compare apples to oranges. This is coronavirus data for different countries. And Cuba, this is just in terms of vaccination. Cuba has 60 for every 100 people has been given at least one dose rather of the vaccine, because it has its 5 of its own vaccines. We're talking about 6.8 million coronavirus doses. That's more than Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is one of the richest countries in the world per capita, and Cuba has done more per capita vaccination than rich Saudi Arabia. It's also done more than New Zealand. In fact, more than twice as much as New Zealand, and more than twice as much as Ecuador and Peru. So this idea that Cuba has had such a bad COVID response, in fact, ironically, in terms of Latin America, Ecuador and Peru, which have right-wing US-backed governments, they had the worst per capita, and Brazil, the worst per capita COVID responses in Latin America. Whereas, what are the 3 countries with the best per capita COVID responses? Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. They happen to be the socialist governments that are called the Troika of tyranny. It's not a coincidence that the countries that spend the most in Latin America on healthcare and have free socialized healthcare in all 3 of those countries, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, they had the best per capita COVID responses. So yes, there are some people protesting and they've been manipulated by social media, and there are some economic difficulties, but we have to understand the roots of them. And you have to compare Cuba to its neighbors. And I'll say, as someone who's traveled all across Latin America, the situation in Cuba, although it's difficult under a U.S. blockade, it's still nothing compared to the living nightmare in Honduras or Dominican Republic or Haiti.
Well, Ben Norton, extremely well researched and presented set of information. So thank you very much for that. Thanks for your great work on this and other topics as well. Again, Ben Norton, my guest, is assistant editor of The Gray Zone and a journalist based in Nicaragua. So once again, thanks for doing this great work, and thanks for coming on the program.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. And thanks for talking about these important issues, because it's really important, especially in the United States. We as U.S. citizens have a lot of influence over what can happen. And if the U.S. government is forced to respond to the American people, then we can force it to stop the 60-year blockade, which, as the Mexican president AMLO said in response to all the protests coverage, he said, if countries really want, specifically he was talking about the U.S., if the U.S. really wants to help the Cuban people, it should lift the blockade. And we as U.S. citizens can pressure the U.S. government to do that.
Well said. And we will be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.